the top of the mountain in 1:15.8. If he keeps that up, I hate to think what the final lap time
Oh, he's hit the fence and he's gone off the track into a tree!
Bathurst is a track with a lot of history. Over time, a lot of it has been forgotten, but not this moment. To this day, Dick Johnson's 1983 off is remembered as a legendary crash, but what's often forgotten, at least in detail, is what happened afterwards. In less than 24 hours, Johnson was back on the mountain in another green stuff Falcon, thanks to a Herculean rebuild effort involving 3 cars and the tireless work of dozens of mechanics and painters. Sadly, the efforts didn't quite work out, and the bad luck continued after the race, but it's still a fantastic story. The Bathurst 1000 is Australia's greatest motor race, and arguably the most spectacular part of the event is a special qualifying shootout, wherein the top 10 qualifiers are given a second chance to grab pole position. However, the rewards are counted with a huge amount of risk. In 1983, Dick Johnson was angling to knock Peter Brock off his first place perch for bragging rights as much as anything, and was fully committed. His Falcon bucked and slid as, with boots full of throttle and fistfuls of steering, he roared over the mountain, but it all went wrong as he exited Forest Elbow. As he set his eyes on Conrod Strait, understeer called out Johnson, and the Falcon slid into the wall with its rear wheel. In his autobiography he wrote, "It wasn't much of a wall, so I thought I was going to be okay. I kept on the throttle. Then the second hit came, as the front tyre smacked into a tyre bundle, destroying both it and most of the steering assembly. The Falcon was now out of control, and Johnson could do nothing but crouch down and hope he would avoid the biggest trees." The car came to a rest in the trees. Marshals rushed to Johnson's aid. Johnson crawled out under his own power and looked down at yet another wrecked Falcon. Television feeds suddenly cut as Johnson ran over one of the broadcasting cables, resumed with footage of the carnage and Johnson standing nearby. As the dust settled and people began to help where they could, one of those on scene early was Peter Brock, Johnson's arch-rival. He was warming up for his own hot lap, but stopped to see if he could help, and ended up driving his day's competitor back to the pits. Aside from the slight amnesia, the only injuries reported were a sore neck and a small cut above one of his eyes. Nothing else. An incredible escape. The car, on the other hand, was absolutely stuffed. It would later be turned into paperweights, but not before what could be salvaged was, including the race cam equipment which had helped make Johnson a star. Crucially, however, the motor was also salvageable, safe within the battered wreck, and would roar back into life in less than 24 hours, as plans were made to get Dick Johnson back into the race. Dick Johnson, by 1983, was a legend in his own right. Against the dominance of the factory and tobacco company-backed Metropolitan Brock, Dick had emerged as his opposite, a rough-and-ready Queenslander, slogging away for every opportunity and never saying die, despite his hardships. Until that weekend, his biggest hardship had put him on the map for many people. At Bathurst in 1980, his first quick Falcon, True Blue, had been taken out of the race lead by an errant rock that had been accidentally rolled onto the track. It was a freak, heartbreaking accident, and as Johnson, in a mid-race interview after the fact, poured out his difficulties with tears welling in his eyes, switchboards for Channel 7 across Australia were jammed with promises of money to help him.
Dick, the switchboards at all the 7 stations across Australia are jammed of people who are so upset about what has happened, and they, believe it or not, ringing and just genuinely pledging money to help you. Now this has happened in the last half hour.
The movement became so big it even caught the ear of Edsel Ford II, who quickly made his own promise. He would match every donation dollar for dollar. In all, $144,000 was given to Dick Johnson's team, who put the money to good use. Johnson's attitude to racing had won him a lot of fans, including some competitors. Even Brock spoke well of him. This general goodwill started the rebuild efforts in 1983 too, as not one but 2 other entrants gave up their cars and their chances to drive in the 1000 to help Johnson. "Let's buy another one." These words, spoken by Ross Palmer, ignited the campaign to see Johnson and his Falcon rise from the ashes. Palmer was the primary sponsor for Dick Johnson's team, owning steel tube mills which made products such as True Blue and Green Stuff, as well as a close friend, and asked competitor Andrew Harris if he would sell his Falcon to him. Harris had mixed feelings about giving up his car, as he had sponsor obligations to fulfill with Channel 9 and Bendigo, but went ahead on the basis that Palmer would give him a similarly competitive race car. This ended up being a Holden Commodore owned by Barry Lawrence, one which had seen a top 5 finish at an event earlier in the year. Lawrence would not be getting another car as part of a deal, but agreed to lend his car to Palmer for $40,000 on the basis that Johnson was a Queenslander and a mate. The plan started to come together as the various parties tested their prospective rides. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, Harris tested the Commodore while first Bartlett and Johnson, hours after his horrendous shunt, felt out the Falcon. His quickest lap in what was still visually the Channel 9 car was logged at 2 minutes 26.6 seconds, 10 seconds slower than what the green stuff machine had done. But it was a Falcon and would get a better motor as part of the plan, so trades were confirmed and the rebuild began. It was a fairly complicated process, so I'll do my best to simplify it. Lawrence's Commodore would become the Harris Channel 9 Commodore with a Ford motor and gearbox, while Harris's Channel 9 Falcon would be reborn as Green Stuff Mark II. This would be achieved using the original's motor and gearbox, but incorporating suspension and driveline parts from both cars. Both cars would also be repainted. The Harris Falcon would undergo its transplants in the Dick Johnson Racing Workshop before being moved to a specialist shed for repainting, while the Commodore would be stripped down and reborn entirely inside the TAFE shed. If you were to think of the Mount Panorama circuit as a battlefield, the TAFE shed was a field hospital. Any vehicles requiring major or specialist work beyond the skill level of the teams would be taken there and repaired free of charge by apprentice mechanics from the local tertiary and further education college. In 1977, Clive Weiss, a teacher at the college, set up a program where apprentice students would work at the racetrack for the entirety of the Bathurst 1000 week, assisting teams to fix their cars and giving students a valuable, high-exposure, real-world experience. In 1983, 10 young mechanics between the ages of 18 and 20 had a huge all-nighter before them. This was the TAFE crew, and this night, more than any other, will secure their legacy. According to Weiss, 4 days' work was being compressed into 4 hours. George Shepherd, the boss of Dick Johnson Racing, echoed those sentiments.
Well, the hardest thing is that you're trying to do so many things in such a small area with so many people, I suppose. You're taking a motor car and we're trying to introduce into it all the development that we've found in our car over a whole year, in Dick's car, into a car that's a year old and hasn't had any development since.
On top of that, the Johnson camp had the added difficulty of mixing and matching components, a headache on 2 levels. Firstly, there was the actual mixing itself, choosing which parts of the 2 vehicles to put into the final version. Dick Johnson Racing wheels were attached to their own hubs, but the brakes were a combination from axle to axle, and the Harris Falcon kept its roll bars, which is when the second headache became apparent, the consequences of this improvisation. The XC Falcons were difficult to tune and set up for handling, and while Johnson's team had solved these problems the best, a year of development was now being patched into a second-tier Falcon by people who had no experience in such an extensive rebuild, especially with such a tight deadline. The Commodore was mechanically finished by 1:30 AM, and the Falcon was done sometime after 3 AM. 2 full rebuilds in about 8 and 10 hours respectively. Most of the time I spent rebuilding the cars that night and the next morning was taken up by painting, with periods of drying between stripping cars to the original paint, then applying undercoat, then topcoat, and then duplicating the sign writing and decals. The sign writing for the Falcon took 6 hours, and Saturday's all-night rebuild blurred into Sunday's race morning. Start time was strict 10 AM. Throughout the rebuild, fans and supporters were quietly gathered outside Johnson's tent, a stark contrast to the drunken, boisterous mobs at the top of the hill on race day. Early that morning, race organisers, the Australian Racing Drivers Club, asked the top teams about letting Johnson's car, still being repainted at the time, don't forget, to start from 10th, and no voices were raised against the proposal. At 9:15, cars were pushed out to the grid amidst the pre-race fanfare. Johnson's car was absent. But at 9:33, 27 minutes from the fall of the green flag, the green stuff machine rose from the ashes to wild applause and took a special sighting lap to let Johnson assess the situation. As he passed the lowest qualifiers at Murray's Corner, the Falcon rumbled into the pits for a quick tune-up and took its place on the grid, passing Harris's Channel 9 Commodore to qualify 30th. The paint was still drying.
The start of the great race is 10 seconds away. Racing in the 83 James Hardy Classic. Peter Brock in the 05 car off the inside gets away smartly, but Fury comes up with him. Jansen has been outgunned on the inside by John Harvey, who will move to third for the first time. Jim Richards then coming back on the inside of Peter Jansen. There's Dick Johnson making a good start too.
At the end of the first lap, Johnson was 11th and Harris was 25th. With the original Holden motor, it had been the fastest of the Commodores in a straight line, and in the early laps rocketed up to 7th, passing the Falcon on lap 16, which, as the race progressed past quarter distance, sank to 39th place. This was in part due to an unscheduled pit stop caused by gremlins which would eventually doom the car. Issues with the electrical system had flattened the battery and, more seriously, crippled Ace pump which helped cool oil in the gearbox. The problem didn't go away and the Falcon's gearbox seized soon after on lap 61 as Johnson went through the cutting. Before that final blow, in a mid-race interview, Johnson had lamented the Falcon's handling. But the Commodore, shared by rookie Andrew Harris and Gary Cook, finished in 10th place, in a car which had been largely rebuilt the night before. The performance was enough for Harris to be given the Rookie of the Year trophy. Barry Lawrence was happy, but thought the car, as it originally had been, could have been a top 5 contender. This is a story of incredible effort which lionizes all involved, but it has cruel endings. The next morning, Johnson's road car was found lightly vandalized, with a poster celebrating Brock's 7th Bathurst victory placed under a windscreen wiper and graffiti drawn on its dusty bonnet. But worse was to happen. Bill Tucky reports in the official book for 1983 James Hardy 1000, vowing to be back with 2 cars next year, the Johnson team set off for Brisbane with Andrew Harris's F100 Towmaster, as Johnson had kindly offered to respray and recondition the 9 Falcon as part of the deal. The F100 was towing the trailer on which the wreckage lay, but 40 kilometres west of Bathurst it broke a tow ball and the rig went off the road, totaling everything, including the F100. From that passage it sounds as though both Green Stuff cars, the original and Harris's donor, were caught up in that crash, although a Wheels article from 1983 makes no mention of Harris's car, but that wasn't the end of Johnson's and Harris's shared woes. While they were at Bathurst, their workshops, respectively in Brisbane and Melbourne, were burgled. That's a frustrating insult to the injuries both camps had suffered over the previous 3 days. But even those troubles cannot distract from the huge efforts taken on that weekend, which is still remembered today in one of Bathurst's greatest stories.